Hello, welcome listeners to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love hosted by Richard Osler. My guest on today's podcast is an author who's got a terrific new book out and a friend, my friend Russ Hinckley, joining us from Arizona. Welcome to the podcast, Russ.
Thank you, Richard. I really appreciate you having me on. And I just have listened to you over the years and love the peaceful, gentle spirit you bring to this work.
Well, thank you. Let me introduce Russ to you, and then let me share a little bit about the book he's written that's available on Amazon, and then we'll get Russ talking about his book. Russ and I have a lot in common. He's a little older than me, but just 2 years. We both served missions in England. Russ served in Birmingham, England from 78 to 80. He grew up in Salt Lake City, the Holiday area. He's Olympus High graduate, class of 77, and I'm a Highland graduate, class of 79. So you've got two older guys on the show today, listeners. He is a married father, husband, has 3 daughters, 5 grandchildren. His wife is Susan Hinckley, that you listeners may recognize from the podcast that they run, At Last She Said It, and the book they wrote to that same title. Professionally, Russ is not retired. He spent the whole week prior to this podcast doing work. He has, and this could be a whole nother podcast, he's been in the airline loyalty program, the credit card co-branded program, and has just had a whole career in that world, works with banks right now and their co-branded credit cards. And all of us as consumers rarely get access to someone like Russ. And I could probably tell the inner workings of all these loyalty programs, but we'll save that for another day, even though I'm kind of curious about how that works. People may wonder with a name like Hinckley in the church if he's Gordon B. Hinckley's son or grandson, and he is not. He's a second cousin, probably once removed, but I wanted to let you know. The book we're going to talk about is called Beyond Belief, and I want to read one of the excerpts, one of the forwards that someone has written for the book. Jeff Anderson, someone I respect. Russ Hinckley shows how the life and ministry of Jesus can serve as a powerful pattern for living rather than just something to be discussed at church on Sundays. He shows how one can truly follow Jesus in walking the path rather than just believing in it. He reminds us that we must move beyond conversations about correct belief to engage in the revolutionary actions of Jesus. And he has a lot of 5-star reviews on Amazon. I'll just read a couple of them. I found the book to be refreshing, taking me back to the reasons of why I believe in Jesus Christ and his gospel. I recommend this read to anyone wanting to deepen their spiritual roots. One such book is Russ Hinckley's Beyond Belief, where we are reminded to get back to the basics of what Jesus was all about. Thank you, Russ, for waking us up a little more. I love those 2 reviews, listeners, and we will link to the book. What we're going to do is, and I'm going to get Russ talking and kind of get out of the way here, is the overview of the podcast is first Russ is going to talk about where did the idea come from? Then he's going to give an overview of the book. That'll be the second part of the podcast. And the main heart of the podcast is Russ is going to share 2 examples of topics in the book and then a conclusion. Is that okay for an introduction, Russ?
It's way too generous. I appreciated it'd been a while since I'd looked at those reviews on Amazon, and that's part of the reason I wanted to promote the book a little bit more. People have generally reacted pretty well to the book, and I think your audience would enjoy some teachings from the book. All right, well, here's a little background on how I got started on the book. For some reason, I've always been sort of a scripture geek, and in various church assignments, I've been lucky. I've had a lot of teaching time in the church. And because of that love for scriptures, I was really drawn to Pete Enns' sort of scripture books. One is The Bible Tells Me So, and the other is How the Bible Actually Works. They're great books, by the way. I highly recommend them. Um, and in these books, Pete Enns highlights for the reader really how disconnected sort of religious creeds are from what Jesus was actually trying to teach, which is kind of ironic. And I would say for our audience, I'd say the articles of faith in many ways function like a creed. Um, I hadn't really thought about that much before, but it's true. If you think about it, there's nothing in the articles of faith that really tell you how to live, they tell you what to believe. Um, and I think there's a reason for this kind of disconnect and why creeds became so important. If you think about the times of the early church, you know, Jesus was such a surprise ending to everybody, right? Um, that there needed to ultimately be some sort of formal statements about who Jesus was and what he represented. For example, I think to Jews, um, you know, they were looking for a Davidic type of Messiah. And so they didn't connect the dots particularly well with what Jesus did and what they were sort of looking and hoping for. The Gentiles, on the other hand, it was just as big a problem because Jesus definitely did not look like a pagan god. He was killed by other men, which is really strange. That's really what Paul's talking about, actually, when he says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ." He's not ashamed that he doesn't sound like a pagan god. So Jesus was a problem, and explaining who he was really important. I think our articles of faith actually start in sort of from a different point, but they came about. There were a lot of tracts at the time that missionaries were using to sort of summarize the teachings of the church. And so Joseph Smith sort of formalized that with the articles of faith, and it was important for missionary work. So as I thought about what creeds are and why there's a disconnect, I heard a woman on my wife's podcast. At last, she said it. Um, she created her own articles of faith of how it really spoke to her, and you know that started me thinking, what would happen if Jesus wrote his own creed? What would it look like? Um, And so what I did is, what if you try to move beyond what we're sort of asked and guided to believe about Jesus to what would Jesus really, if he were writing the creed, what would he be telling us to do? And so I started the fun but probably very presumptuous path of um, what would a creed look like if Jesus wrote it? Um, so from there, that's how the book got started. Um, I'll give you an overview of how the book's organized. First, I kind of start with what we talked about earlier of how creeds came into existence and how they were used. And as I mentioned, I have a lot of grace for why creeds were developed. Um, Jesus was definitely a shock to the system, and I think the creeds created a sort of useful summary of Orthodox belief. At the same time, if you try and imagine if you were talking to Jesus today, um, do you think he would start the conversation with, "Do you believe this about me? What about this?" And maybe testing people on what they believed? Or do you think he would spend more time um, and be more interested in what we were doing to love and serve others? And I think the answer is really obvious. So, this is where the book title comes from, about moving beyond belief to really what Jesus would like us to spend our time and energy doing. Um, then I talk about in the book some of the general religious trends in the world. And frankly, they aren't great. Fewer people are attending, and especially young people are seeming to lose interest in many aspects of church. And so I sort of hypothesize that to reverse this decline in the general trends of religion, we need to get back to what Jesus was really trying to teach. And it should be impacting how we live and move through the world. So, as Richard mentioned, because I've been in business for literally forever at this point, my list of the Christ Creed is really a bullet point list because I've been writing for business writers for such a long time. And the list includes these topics: eat with everyone, restore sight and promote healing, include the marginalized, invite but don't chase, focus on people over rules, provide stories, not prescriptive answers, be careful judging results, encourage change, let go of traditional hierarchy and power perceptions, start heaven now, appreciate God's unlimited generosity, realize holiness in everything, embrace complexity, develop relationship and unity. So these are the core the core kind of vignettes of the book of what I think Jesus is trying to do. So the rest of the book really provides a discussion on each of these things. And in the conclusion of the book, which, by the way, was the hardest part of the book to write, I talk about the need for and challenge of church structure. You know, I firmly believe that we need structure as a church to provide a platform for loving and serving others. I think you can do so much more with structure than if you're just out on your own. At the same time, and I've seen this in churches and organizations, um, structure needs to feed itself. And it soon, I think you're spending far too much time in church on items that in business we would call overhead, things that are not particularly useful expenditures versus actually doing the work of what Jesus wanted to do. So I suggest, I think, in reversing some of the trends on religion, really tapping into the more radical elements of Jesus's message. And unfortunately, I think they're just as radical today as they were when he said it. And, you know, I would love, and the reason I wrote this book is I really want to change the ratio of what we talk about at church. I'd like to spend a lot less time on boundary and culture maintenance and more time on Jesus' work, sort of a real rewilding of his message. Sorry, I got a little emotional there, but that's what I wanted to do.
Wow. You're taking a drink of soda, and I'm seeing that through the video, but I just want to, I'm following along listeners in Russ's outline, just underlining things and writing big stars and wow. It's really powerful. And this is,
Oh,
you know, I've always thought Jesus's message to love others is a verb. It's what we're going to do that to really change people's lives. And Russ is, I love that you're going into that space of the action that we need to do to follow Jesus and bless others' lives. Thank you. Keep sharing, Russ.
thank you. Yeah, so I think your listeners might get a feel for the book if we sort of walk through a couple of chapters in the book of what I think would make up sort of a Jesus creed. To me, these things are pretty obvious, and I think many of you will know these things already, and this will be just a subtle reminder of some of these things. I'm certainly not a biblical scholar and not contributing new scholarship to the Jesus work. But I'll start with the first one in the book, and I think everyone would probably come up with this one on their own. Eat with everyone. So if you think about uh, Jesus's ministry, he was engaged in sort of a constant political theater in the gospel with who he ate with. His fellowship with undesirables, I think, was intentionally provoking to the religious establishment. And he did this with a clear purpose, I think, to teach a higher orientation. I love these scriptures in Matthew chapter 15. You'll remember he's the Pharisees come to him and say, "Why do you break the tradition of the elders? Your disciples don't wash their hands before they eat." And Jesus replies, "Why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? Thus you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition, you hypocrites. Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules." Jesus called the crowd around him and said, "Listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them. What comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them." You can also see as this discussion goes on that the disciples are sort of worried about how aggressive Jesus is here. And so the disciples said, "Don't you understand that the Pharisees were offended when you said this?" And Jesus, if you read Jesus as always just Mr. Nice, you're probably reading him wrong. He comes back and he just has no patience for it. He says, "Every plant that my heavenly Father has planted will be pulled up by the roots. Leave them. They are blind guides. If the blind lead the blind, they will both fall into a pit." You'll remember that line from the scriptures. And then Peter says to Jesus, "Explain the parable to us," which is kind of a dumb question if you think about it. It isn't that complicated. And Jesus's response is, "Are you still so dull?" I mean, that is an amazing response, I think. And I love this exchange. And I think it's a great question for us, actually, at this time. Are we still so dull? By eating with everyone, I think Jesus was really demonstrating that people are just so much more important than rules. And I wanted us to ask ourselves the question, are we still being so dull and focusing on the wrong things? And you can see that the disciples, even though they had this amazing experience, they didn't really get the lesson, despite all the admonitions in the scriptures about care for the stranger and the immigrant, which I would say is like a top 10 biblical admonition. The cleanliness laws had developed into these sort of unintended consequences for the Jewish people. And you can see this really clearly in Acts chapter 10. This is one of my favorite scripture stories. When Jesus goes up on the top of the building that he's house, he's hungry and they're preparing food for him. And he goes into a trance, if you'll remember this from the scriptures. And he sees heaven opened and all these different animals come down on the sheet. And a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." And many of these animals that were on the sheet were not traditionally clean animals. And Peter responds back, "Surely not, Lord." Peter replied, "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." Really, this exchange to me is precious. And it's just so funny because he responds to someone who he recognizes as Lord with "surely not, Lord,"
Mm.
right? I mean, that's just amazing. And that shows you the power that culture and tradition can have on people, that it makes them actually resistant at times to what the Lord really wants. Now, Peter does ultimately kind of get the message and move forward. And later in the chapter, when he's entering Cornelius's house and he's entering a large gathering, this is too good. You just can't write stuff this good. His opening line to this Gentile gathering is, "You are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate or visit with a Gentile. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean." That's the worst opening door approach line I've ever heard in my life. And but it's it he ultimately breaks through. And this was, I think, a big push for Jesus, and I think it's so needed in our time as well. Have we ever lived in a really much more divided society than we are in right now? And wouldn't it be great to spend more table fellowship time with people who aren't like us? I mean, I just think Jesus would be wanting us to do um, more of this work. And I think it's important for us. So that was Eat with Everything. I'll do one more that I think that actually was one of my favorite ones to work on and write. And I think it's a little less obvious. It's the one titled "Realize the Holiness in Everything." You know, I think Jesus really had a complicated relationship actually with the temple. Um, on the one hand, he cared enough about the temple to have his temple tantrum and drive the money changers out from his father's house, and he identifies it as his father's house. On the other hand, another time in the scriptures, he just shows remarkable indifference to the temple. Um, his disciples were there at the temple, and this is in Mark chapter 13. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." And Jesus replies, "Do you see all these great buildings?" Replied Jesus, "Not one stone here will be left upon another. Everyone will be thrown down." And I think there's a lot of different ways to interpret this. But this is part of what got him killed. If you'll recall, witnesses against him talked about him threatening to tear the temple down. So this was part of the trial. But I think the complexity of what Jesus was trying to teach was actually a bigger message about holiness and what it is and where it is, actually. And I think you can really see this in Jesus's exchange with the woman at the well in Samaria. You'll recall the start of this story. Jesus is at the well, and his disciples have gone into town to buy food. And Jesus asks for water. And he enters, because she knows he's a Jew and he knows she's a Samaritan, they sort of get into a question about that. And he goes down an interesting path of, everlasting water. And she's interested, and they start to have an interesting exchange. But in verse 19, I think this is where it gets interesting. And I think this is where you can really start to see that Jesus is trying to really broaden our thinking. "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshiped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. Yet a time is coming and has come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the spirit and in truth." So I think Jesus was really suggesting a bigger way to think about the spirit and, frankly, religion, that holiness was no longer going to be tied to place. And he broadens what's holy. And I think the problem with holiness being tied to place, and that was very much in the minds at the time, is that by definition, this makes other places non holy. And I think that's what he was trying to correct. He also, remember the discussion with Nicodemus is that the spirit is a lot freer than just place. He says the spirit's like the wind and it goes where it wants to. So we don't just worship in a place. It's a shift to that everything is holy. The Doctrine and Covenants 29:34 has this great scripture, I think, that should be on all of our short list, where it says, "Wherefore, verily I say unto you that all things unto me are spiritual, and not at any time have I given unto you a law which was temporal." So all things are spiritual to God. And I think this is really radical thinking. Uh, Still, so many people think of just holy places, and I think Jesus thinks everything is holy. Everything that we do is holy. And Paul runs with this notion when he talks about us becoming a temple. He starts to shift from sort of a temple-oriented worship type of thing to us being the temple. And so I think it's nervy of me, but I'm going to quote myself from the
Good.
from from the last part of this section. It says, "Trying to confine our spiritual lives to only sacrifice, place, ritual activity, etc., was never the plan. A tabernacle or temple is a useful stop. We are the destination." And I think so that hopefully gives you a feel for some of the chapters in the book. I think they're pretty fun to read, um, and hopefully a little bit thought provoking as well.
Tell us a little bit about this. You've done this already, but I love you quoting Russ Hinckley yourself. We are the destination. Just add to your thoughts on that for our listeners. We are the destination. I think you've explained that. That's what you've been doing, but just anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I have personally in my life um, had challenges where sometimes I tried to segment everything I was doing. Like I would devote, I had a time parameter of I'll devote this much to my church service, I'll devote this much to work, I'll devote this much to family, I'll devote this much to a hobby or whatever. Um, but I think Jesus, in a lot of ways, tries to make it so there aren't segmentation or lines like that. It's all holy. Like I was a very avid fly fisherman for a long time, and I think Jesus would say your spiritual breakthroughs are just as likely to happen fly fishing as working or doing something else. It all has spiritual implications, um, and so I think we're the destination for the spirit, um, and I believe it can find us in any way at any time.
Go to the conclusion, Russ, and then I've got some more discussion for you.
Great. Um, as I mentioned, the conclusion was really a hard, hard part to write. The chapters were a lot easier because I had been thinking about them for such a long time. But um, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think you really do need church structure. I think it's so important to have a community to serve in and a way to support and sustain people. Um, there's an example in the conclusion too about if you don't have a structure, what happens to you. And I think if you remember some years ago that Occupy Wall Street movement, it got tremendous traction and had tremendous attention. but the people resisted any organization um, while that was going on because they felt that made them too much like what they were protesting. So ultimately,
Mm.
nothing happened. The tents packed up and went away. So I think that's a great example of why you need structure in order to sustain people. At the same time, I think to keep our communities interesting um, and relevant, I think I think we need to capture more energy in our message. And I think the message is out there. I think Jesus gave it to us, and it has this radical feel to it, in a way, this sort of stick it to the man feel that I think would be energizing for the church. I find it really an interesting conundrum that um, Christians today are so resistant to change. And Jesus was just all about change. Think of his Sermon on the Mount. Think of that structure of, you've heard it said, but I say. He's changing things all the time. Uh, and if you think about the world that we live in today, what would he apply that same sort of phrasing to? You've heard it said, but I say. Where would he be challenging us to go further? Um, I think that's the kind of energy that Jesus wants us to be bringing to the church and to the world.
Super powerful. A lot of thoughts, listeners, as you might have. I just want to reread the sections because after you hear two sections, it makes you want to hear them all. And that's why I encourage you to read Russ's book. But Eat with Everyone, which he talked about, restore sight and promote healing, include the marginalized, invite but don't chase, focus on people over rules, provide stories, not prescriptive answers, be careful about judging, encourage change, let go of traditional hierarchy and power perceptions, start heaven now, appreciate God's unlimited generosity, realize holiness in everything that we talked about, embrace complexity, develop relationship and unity. These are all really powerful little titles for these sections that are really powerful once you read them, Russ. I have a few thoughts, listeners. The articles of faith were a big deal for me growing up. We don't talk about them as much, and that's not really my point. I had an institute teacher, S. Michael Wilcox, that sort of talked about the articles of faith were necessary in our faith when Joseph Smith was establishing it. I guess you'd call that a creed, Russ, and just a statement of our belief. And this institute, I think just one article of faith talks about how we treat others. The rest of them are a statement of belief. I'm not sure that's true. I just vaguely remember that. He made the point that it was just necessary to have articles of faith. And that then, I think he cautioned the same thing you're cautioning, Russ, is that is just your whole book is beyond belief. You know, what the articles of faith are needed, and they're a statement of creed or what we believe. But so much of religion is more than just belief. It's the action that belief gives us to help others. And you do it unto the least of me, you do it unto me. So much of, if you love me, you really serve my children. I'm paraphrasing scripture there. I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that, if you want to come back to that, but that's so powerful for me and so consistent with what you teach and what I believe Jesus taught.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the like I said, I don't think I really um, bring new scholarship at all. I think most of you, if you thought about it, your list of the items that would be in Jesus's creed, if he were writing one, would be pretty similar to mine. And in fact, that might be a really fun exercise for people to sort of think through what are the key things that Jesus really tried to get us to do rather than believe?
Mm.
I think I think that would be great time spent um, for everyone. And um, I hope my book sort of gets people to think about that for themselves. I loved what the lady did on it last. She said it, writing her own articles
Mm.
of faith. Uh, I think that's I think that's the type of work that we need to do. Um, the thinking first, and then the actions.
Uh, and I think all of your titles are not necessary. They're, focused on others and serving others and what we can do to improve. So I like that. Um, this next thought I want to share, listeners, I hope doesn't sound too critical of our church, and it's more critical of our culture. I was reading the comments on a recent worldwide devotional where couple of our leaders were speaking, and the topic was, the devotional was kind of billed talking about Christ, but this comment said, we spent so much time talking about the leader and the adulation of the leader and the history of the leader, and which I think is appropriate to some extent, as you're talking, to use your words, creating a structure that's needed. But this listener, this commenter said there's an opportunity cost there because we failed to talk about Jesus, really. We failed to read from the New Testament of his teachings. And because we have a structure that's really strong and centralized with leaders, I think sometimes for me, the balance is off there. I support and sustain our leaders, but sometimes for me anyway, the focus is so much. Religion is more than just defending our religion and defending the institution church. It's really getting to talk about the changes we need to make in our lives and the things that we can do to bless others' lives that are really represented so well in the New Testament as you're sharing with us. I hope that's okay, listeners. It's just a tone thing that I'm sensitive to, and sometimes I feel we're a little imbalanced there. Any thoughts on that, Russ?
Yeah, I do have a lot of thoughts on that. I think um, Jesus was the antithesis, really, of um, hierarchical power, in my opinion. If you think about uh, some of his great teachings, remember when the disciples came to him and said, "We saw these guys casting out devils in your name, but they weren't on our team, and we told them to stop it." And Jesus's response was basically, "I don't care what jersey people are wearing. If they're doing my work, whatever." And he also, so instead of promoting himself, he also said, you know, "You'll do bigger things than I've done." Um, so I think he's very different about hierarchical power than we sort of are. Um, and I think it's easy to get out of balance on that in an organization that rightly people with special skills rise up in an organization, but that isn't, it's not like a corporation, I would say, in that regard.
One of the things I've noticed, great comments. One of the things I've noticed is my wife and I have gone from being in our home ward to serving as a ministering couple in our YSA ward in our area is testimony meeting. And maybe the comments in Elders Corman Sunday School, they are more focused on Jesus and more focused on serving others and our responsibility to serve others, and less on sort of, defending the institution of the church. I think a testimony can't be our feelings about the church. That would be logical, but they've shifted a little bit into a lane of really focusing their testimony and their statement of belief, which is the title of your book, Beyond Belief, into things that I'm trying to bless the lives of others and examples of others that are blessing the lives of others. And for me, that's been a really positive experience. And we had 17 testimonies in our 1 hour testimony meeting last week compared to maybe 8 or 9 or 6 or 5 in our home ward because people like me talk longer and the youth are a little more concise in their testimonies and you get a little more breadth. So I have a lot of hope. There seems to be an increased focus on the things that you're talking about, Russ, with our younger members. I don't know if that's factual or not, and I don't know when some of your book is talking about people that have left. If some of the people that have left because of the institutional challenges, but there's probably still. I don't know. I don't want to draw any conclusions. I don't know if you've got any insights on that.
Well, I think that's a great observation, and I actually do have a lot of faith in the youth of today. Um, I think if you spend time with some of the youth today, and certainly my own kids, and um, I don't think they care about boundaries the way older people. I just don't. I mean, I don't. I think I think for that they have lived with society in many ways being and friends being sort of boundaryless for a long time, and it makes them, I think, more open to new ideas. Um, that's the that's the example that I went through in Acts 10 with Peter. I mean, they're less grounded in um, that things are only one way. Um, and I think that can be scary from an institutional standpoint, but at the same time, um, it represents tremendous freedom and the capability to progress.
I've thought of the visual imagery that I've come up with to the need for the institutional church is a swimming pool or a hot tub, and
Mm,
the water in the pool or the hot tub. Let's do a hot tub, listeners. Is pure. It represents the pure gospel of Jesus Christ that you're talking about, and all the teachings that Christ talked about that heal us and help us heal others. And I've always felt the gospel is perfect. His teachings are perfect, but we need an institutional church. To me, that's this hot tub, 4 sides of hot tub or a round hot tub to make that gospel possible in our lives. But sometimes you sit back in a hot tub below the waterline and there's imperfections that might even jar you. And they're
mm.
imperfections that others may not see or even believe that are there. So I've always felt the institutional church is not perfect. The gospel is. It's needed. I support and sustain it. It may be giving people different experiences below the waterline than I'm feeling. It's always been really, generally smooth for me. So that's just a framework that I've had to use, listeners, to sort of navigate. I believe the church isn't perfect, the people aren't perfect, but the pure gospel of Jesus Christ that Russ is sharing with us is. That's just a metaphor that I've used. Go ahead.
I like it. I think the metaphor I've heard other people use is like the church is sort of the
Yeah, I love
scaffolding,
that one.
right? And we don't worship the scaffolding. We worship what it's helping to support.
Here's a question that's not in our prepared notes, but um, tell us about your wife and Cynthia and what they've done with their podcast and book. Did that surprise you? I mean, here you are
Well,
10 years. I think it started their podcast roughly the same time as mine, 8, 10 years ago. So here you are sitting here, and your wife and Cynthia have got this really outstanding podcast and well named in a book. Just give us your thought as the spouse of Susan on how
well,
this all unfolded in your eyes.
uh, first of all, just tremendous pride for what um, Susan and Cynthia have built. I mean, it just exceeded everyone's expectation. Uh, they started virtually at ground zero with nothing, and have built, uh, not just a lot of downloads. I mean, I don't know what they've got to be coming in on 2.5 million downloads, but they built a community, and I think they're doing great work there by giving women in particular, a place where they can come together and see that other people are struggling with some of the same things that they are. Um, and so I think that's priceless. And I think it's great work, and I'm just super proud of that.
And you're emotional again. For the second
Yeah.
time, I can tell how much you care and how proud you are. That's is a terrific podcast, listeners. I mean, Russ has had a front seat to that, obviously. And I don't know when the idea first came up in a discussion and how Cynthia and Susan got together, but as I've listened to that podcast as a male in the church, I've just there's been blind spots that have been pointed out to me. I wish I could have listened to that podcast, in my 20s before I had any church assignments, or my teens as I was better supporting the women in my life, my mom, my sisters. Um, it's just such important content to hear Latter day perspective, Latter day Saint perspectives from women as a man, not just women that are finding community and sort of sometimes the shared pain and the shame stories, but for me as a dude to hear, blind spots that I have in my ministry, and my honest heart to want to do the best for men and women, and recognizing, because you hear these stories and then you feel kind of, one of the things I've tried to do, listeners, is when I feel uncomfortable, I used to think, well, that's the spirit leaving the room. Now I sit with that for a while and think, is that, in this case, sexism that's present
Yeah.
in me that's now feeling uncomfortable because I've actually seen something different, and felt something different. And I sit with that feeling, listeners, and try to think, are these changes I need to make in my discipleship to go beyond belief, to use Russ's book term that's really awesome, and the changes I need to make to better follow Jesus, and in this case, better support women in their journey in the church and valuing their voices in a way that I never understood the need for or knew had the skills to do that. One of the things that podcast taught me was, in ward council, to have the women comment on men's issues. I remember for the first time asking our Relief Society president to comment on an elders quorum issue. She was reluctant at first, but she, once prompted, had incredible insights. And the culture was kind of women comment on women issues and men comment on women and men issues. And I thought this wonderful Relief Society president would probably have some really good insights if we could get her talking. And that came from that podcast. So anyway, I joined with you, Russ, as a listener. You joined as a spouse. Um, Anything else you'd like to share on anything that's in your heart or mind right now?
Well, I was just going to say, obviously to stay married, I've had to become more sensitive to feminine issues. And, uh, and it's been a great awakening for me. And I've listened to every episode. I think
Wow.
it's just super high quality
Wow.
stuff. And, you know, a year or so ago, I got asked to substitute in primary, and I just love teaching primary kids. I've only had that assignment once or twice in my life, but we were singing a song. It was "Follow the Prophets" song, and kids got to come up and pick a prophet picture and hold it in front of their face when they were on that one. And a girl came up, and there were no girl pictures. And she goes, "Where are the women?" And
Wow.
once you see stuff like that, you can't unsee it. Uh, and I think we should always be asking all the time, "Where are the women?"
Wow. What a great place to end. I'm just going to reread this Amazon review after hearing Russ's podcast. I found this book to be refreshing, takes me back to the reasons of why I believe in Jesus Christ. And then the last one said, Russ Hinckley's book, Beyond Belief, where we are reminded to get back to the basics of what Jesus was all about. Thank you, Russ, for waking us up a little more. I love that. I think it's a great closing line for this book, your podcast, your voice, and all of us listeners that want to do better. So thank you, Russ Hinckley. We'll put a link in the show notes to his book and anything else Russ wants included. And this is Richard Ostler, Russ Hinckley signing off. And thank you, our listeners, for listening and sharing this podcast with others.